Hi guys, this is the sixth lecture and it is on the structure of poetry, which you may think the last lecture um, touched on that topic as well, and it did, but this is more formally focused on that. The study of poetry is called prosody or versification, and it's dealing with the rhythms and the particular meters of poetry. Um, Again, I am focusing on the yellow areas in the outline. So what are the forms of poetry? According to your textbook, we can pretty much divide all poetry, and you know how I feel about neat divisions, so these are not going to be that neat. But we can pretty much identify poetry into conventional, or traditional poetry. And conventional or traditional poetry is old. This is part of the connection and oral interpretation to to ancient Greece, ancient Rome, to some of the really old forms of poetry. It's based on a clearly discernible pattern of stresses. So if you've never studied meter in poetry before, this could be helpful. You may pick a poem that doesn't have a discernible meter or at least a consistent one. Usually my students are more inclined to pick free verse, but if you do, I've included here a couple other sources that you might want to look at. Believe it or not, Shmoop, I know it's not a scholarly source, even though it's what produced by Harvard students. It does have a really good primer in the basic meters, iambic, trochaic, those basic meters that you're most familiar with, dactylic. So that's a really good primer right there. And just for fun, here's a poem by Coleridge that if you take the time to look at this site, you should look at this poem because he sort of pokes fun at all the different labels that we have for meters, okay? But if you've never discovered meter before, personally, it's difficult for me. I have to use the dictionary to look up where the emphasis is on a certain syllable, and I use the dictionary to help me when I scan a line of poetry, which means when I determine its meter. But it can be very helpful in a formalized meter. All these things that we look at the structure of poetry. We want the structure to support this sense. So if you have a very formalized, highly structured, metered poem that you want to see, does that contribute to the meaning of the poem? Is the subject of the poem also very formalized? Is the subject of the poem very strict and serious? And um, you want to see if it can be contained that way. Sometimes you're going to have a very highly metered poem and you can see no connection between the meter or the sound and its sense. And if that's the case, I just wouldn't comment on it. Comment on something that you understand. But some people are able to make great use of meter. Okay, blank verse employs meter but not rhyme. Okay, so you might have something that's highly metered but not rhymed. Free verse is the newer kind of poetry and the one that we study, it seems, most often to me. And hopefully you noted in your book that it is how old? 125 years old, or roughly there, and maybe 130. It's not that old of a form. It's like it's like the novel. The novel is not that old of a form. Very often we tie the novel. Ian Watt ties it to Robinson Crusoe in 1719, and there are some other sources that tie it to 11th century text and some older text, but pretty much since the 20th century, we thought the novel, what we would constitute as a novel, is not that old. And a lot of these literary forms that we spend a lot of time studying are not that old. Oral interpretation, on the other hand, has a very long, long history. Okay, it has a lot of rhythm, and it is based on cadence or the sounds of speech, not meter, because cadence is meant to mirror speech and create emphasis. Don't be tempted to think that the meter in a free verse poem is less important than the regular scheduled meter in a traditional poem. You might have moments, in fact, I say right here, be aware that the forms combine. You might have a free verse poem that has two lines dropped in the middle of iambic pentameter. Now there's something worth noting. Because you don't have the stringent structures controlling a free verse poem like you do a conventional or traditional poem, you can examine everything as a choice. So if there's a line that's only two syllables long or one syllable, that's a moment of great emphasis. So contrary to what you may be inclined to think, a free verse poem actually presents a lot more choices than a conventional or traditional poem. And a traditional poem presents a lot of ways that the author was able to conform to a structure and work within that to create meaning. So both offer us a lot of opportunities for analysis. I want you to always think about how can form inform variety, unity, and sense. You know, a famous example I mentioned last time, the Highwayman, and that meter often sounds like somebody marching. The Charge of the Light Brigade, the meter is often said to sound like the forwarding motion of soldiers. If you look at the poem I talked about John Donne last year, last lecture, Death Be Not Proud, follows a strict sonnet formula until the last line that says, Death, thou too shall die. And in that last word, die, we should have a rhyme, and we don't. So the poem breaks the pattern at a key place. And here the form emulates the sense. He's saying death shall die. The pattern of death, the pattern of the cycle of life and death, John Donne is saying in that poem, it shall be destroyed, that death thou too shall die, that you cannot, it's not going to be a permanent thing. So he uses the structure of the poem to contribute to the sense. It's really awesome. You can discover the ways that structure contributes to sense. Just thinking of another John Donne poem, The Flea functions in a lot of tercets, three-line stanzas, and there's a lot of religious imagery in that poem. Perhaps you could say that the three-line tercets reflect the Trinity, okay? You might think that's a stretch, but there are a lot of ways that we can see the way that form and sound contribute to sense, and that's really important in the study of poetry. Okay. There are three kinds of prosody you're going to consider: the metrical foot, the stress, where the stress is placed, and syllabic counting. Where the stresses count helps to figure metrical feet. There's another kind called sprung rhythm. And in that kind of rhythm, a foot is determined by the number of emphases. So Hopkins does this, and if any of you think you have that kind, it does make for a very musical poem and very pretty to listen to. Okay, so I think that's about all for the structure of poetry. The main point is you want to always consider how structure and sound contribute to sense in both your analysis and your performance. And hopefully you have selected your great poem and are committing it to memory. I look forward to seeing your performances.